Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, January 24th of 2023, where two laypersons, a pastor, and an academician gather for about 45 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday, and in this case, a letter as well. The Sunday is January 29th of 2023. Each Tuesday, we call in from wherever we may be to participate. And today, we're calling in at 6 a.m., and for our friend Charles Willard of Minnesota, that's 5 a.m. Central. Thank you, Charles. Our team's working to be faithful to Year A, and that puts us in the Gospel of Matthew, and during the coming weeks of Epiphany, using the letters identified in the lectionary to create understanding in the Gospel text. We hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. Here's how it works. We develop perspectives independently after the leadoff person shares some formative questions, and then in this virtual discussion room, we share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion. Sarah, introduce yourself.
Sarah Mickelson in Tampa, Florida.
Charles.
Charles Willard in Minnesota.
Bill.
Bill Hall, St. Petersburg, Florida.
Thank you.
By the way, it's 20 degrees here.
And it's 30 here. I'm Don Upton. I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. And today we are working with two parts of the lectionary. One, of course, is the gospel, which is where we're seated each week. But we're also looking at Corinthians. And so I'm going to read the Corinthians passage in a moment. But first, let's start with the gospel. So I'm going to turn to our friend Charles Willard to read that lectionary in Matthew 5, 1 through 12. Charles, would you do that for us?
Yes. Although I was prepared to go the other way, so this is fine. The gospel text for this particular Sunday is Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will receive God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you."
Thanks, Charles. And then for the letters, we are reading in 1 Corinthians. Today it's chapter 1, verses 18 through 31. I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. "For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and the Greeks desire wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards, but not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing the things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. He is the source of your life in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, in order that, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Well, let's dive right into this. This is an interesting combination of readings, and that's, of course, what the lectionary planners have asked us to do. So I'm going to, Sarah, start with you with the first question, if that's okay. And here it is. What do the 1 Corinthians and Matthew passages do to help us understand Paul's comments on foolishness, such as foolishness to those who are perishing? Are you encountering messages about foolishness of the follower of the way, foolishness of the Christ from the outside, from others, or from the inside within yourself? So I'm trying to patch together the foolishness message, of course, with what we're reading in Matthew. But for each of you, this same question in our own hearts: foolishness from the outside and foolishness from our own hearts. Sarah?
I'm gonna say both and. I'm regularly evaluating my knowledge and my awareness of presented and perceived wisdom. I'm continually reconsidering what I think is presented as wisdom and what is presented as folly. Do I know enough or all of it? No. Am I teachable? I hope so. And what might I learn from the scenario or situation presented or experienced? I'm always thinking about that. Am I growing more timid about, I am growing more timid about my confidence with which I speak in situations for people, to people, and about problems. Have I been observant enough? What would or should I say that would be a loving response? And is a response needed? Because sometimes I'm guilty of fixing or trying to fix things. I'm sure people in our listening circle will resonate with that too, that oftentimes things don't need to be fixed. We just need to listen. So I'm still pondering whether or not I'm even qualified to articulate.
Thank you, Sarah. Bill Hall, what do you think?
I think throughout this discussion, and I think in later next week's, there's a constant running contrast. And you said in your message to us in your email that we are taking the challenge of looking at the Sermon on the Mount through the lens of Paul's letters. I would say we're looking both ways. We're interpreting the Matthew passage in light of Corinthians and Corinthians in light of Matthew. Foolishness, a strong word. The Beatitudes are in this passage, and in a sense, they are foolish compared to the wisdom of the world. This reflection reminded me of something I hadn't thought of for years. As a small child growing up in the church, the custom was that all the children would gather together and sing choruses and then go off by grade level, okay? And one that we often sang, I didn't know at the time what it was. It's in the Old Testament, Zechariah 4:6. It's a very peppy song. I will spare you the trauma of my singing it for you. Not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. And my father happened to be superintendent of the Sunday school, and he would often make the comment, I think, germane to your question, on reminding us as children there was a difference between God's way in the world and the human way in the world. And that's a chorus that's very relevant right now in our current situation, not by might nor by power, but by the Spirit of God. I'm not using this as an advertisement, but my wife and I are currently working our way through the series The Chosen. Frankly, I've had mixed reactions to it, but it powerfully and consistently depicts how counterculture Jesus was and invited his disciples to be. And I think one thing that's true to the Bible in that TV series is that the disciples resist the wisdom of God. It's not just the people out there, the Roman authorities or the Pharisees. Jesus' own disciples have trouble getting it. And Don, that's something I focus on thinking about your question is, how am I living by the wisdom of the world? And it reminds me of a counseling concept. Behavior is a function of perception. The way I see you or the world or whatever leads to my behavior. So if I see the world through the power of dominance and wanting to be king of the mountain, that will influence my behavior. If instead, admittedly, inadequately, I see somehow through the eyes of God, that will affect my behavior.
Thank you. I think I just want to highlight you're making a segue, I think, to next week's podcast, which you're going to lead, where there's the tangibility of the gospel, the salt and light, to help make it real for us. So, this will be something we're going to continue in the next week.
Right.
Charles, what do you think, Charles?
I'm struck by the way that we approach these letter and gospel sayings, and one of the things that I'm eventually going to be able, would like to be able to go through and take a look and see just what difference it makes that we approach the texts in the opposite way that they were actually created. The Gospels were written after Paul's letters, although we don't get them that way. And what difference that makes, I keep asking myself, how did this come to pass? Why didn't somebody get it straightened out so that we know when the Gospels were there and when the letters were written, and how one follows the other, and then ask ourselves, what was it that Paul was doing when he was writing all the things that he was writing, aware of all of the written and spoken parts of the gospel that were there, but we don't get it that way. We get it the other way around because the Bible that we have set it up that way. It's a strange thing. I find it strange.
Thank you. Well, and also a good reminder about these are minimum contemporary writings, and to imagine how principles of the Sermon of the Mount reaching the new churches across that part of the world is interesting to me too. I asked this question because I struggle with it, and for me it's a reminder that repentance doesn't mean that the temptation of foolishness goes away. It doesn't mean that the ease of calling the gospel foolish disappears. And by saying that, I hear the gospel called foolish all the time in different dimensions. And I hear it in my own heart. So it doesn't mean that the inner voice of examining one's calling goes away either. I think it's important to state that. Some might call it doubt. And let me throw out the synonyms of those who are perishing, foolish or perishing. and I'm using English, forgive me, Charles, so we're using a translation, and then I'm using English synonyms, so I'm really off base here, but I just think it's helpful when you think about foolishness, the synonyms we use today. Consider these: stupid, witless, brainless, senseless, unintelligent, ridiculous, absurd, nonsensical, preposterous, imprudent, thoughtless, impetuous, rash, reckless, foolhardy, half-baked, heedless, incautious, trivial, unimportant. And I think Paul's issuing a challenge here, not just to consider foolishness of what he calls those who are perishing. You know, how do practical people, and I think the foolishness is often in practical thinking, you know, become impetuous. And then to turn it on ourselves, do I hear the self-criticism of the cross? You know, that the cross is absurd, nonsensical, ridiculous, unintelligible, senseless, brainless. Do you hear that? I do. It's from the outside, yes, and I hear it from the inside as well. And then here's the Sermon on the Mount. I think the principles and the ethic of the Sermon on the Mount are present in this church that Paul's writing to. I think it's been tangible for the church in Corinth. Despite those things, despite the tangibility, Paul in the first chapter of this book is saying, despite those things you don't seem to remember, that you can taste it and you can feel it, and that within your own hearts, even now, you are still questioning what you're doing is foolish. So I think it's this, back to the, we talked about last week, the setup of the first chapter. You know, don't consider just the foolishness of others, but I'll consider the kind of bombardment of foolishness and the questioning of what you're doing in your own hearts, which really sets up chapter 2 quite nicely. So Bill Hull, the next question is for you. Nice simple one here. What is the wisdom of the wise, friend? What is the wisdom of the wise?
Short but challenging question. Assuming you're referring to verse 19, it says, "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart," reference to Isaiah 29, verse 14 in the Old Testament. So in that context, the wisdom of the wise, we are told, that there's such strong language in this, foolishness, and there's that list of synonyms you were saying a moment ago. Powerful language. This is referring to the wisdom of the supposed wise that is going to be destroyed in light of the wisdom of God. And you're right, there are connections between this week and next week, and this contrast between the wisdom of the world or the wisdom of those who think they're wise and the wisdom of God just goes on and on. It's interesting to me, by my count, in the New Revised Standard Version, in these 23 verses of 1 Corinthians, the word, a form of wisdom or wise, occurs 12 times. 12 times in 23 verses. That's a signal to us that this contrast is so important to Paul and to us. And I think you say, what is the wisdom of the wise? I think it has to do with self-delusions. I think it has to do with pride and ego. All of us would want to be thought of as wise. At least in my brain, in and of itself, wisdom is a warm, fuzzy concept, a powerful to see things clearly. Sarah, I think you were referring to how you keep learning and wanting to be teachable. And there again is a positive term. I want to be teachable. Hopefully this podcast is about all of our being teachable. So again, it's a challenging concept, Don, and I hesitate because I think there's so much here that I think I'm not yet seeing, but I like that it's a journey. We don't have to wrap this all up in a neat little package and bow it and give it. We keep searching, and I still want to be wise, and I hope that is in part the wisdom of God.
Thanks. I wonder if Paul's pointing out just a reminder of how powerful the wisdom of the wise is in our life. Like you, Bill, you're saying, it's like I want to be wise. We want to be wise, but there's a practical reason for that, which why it's so overwhelming. It can overwhelm the gospel, and I make up my own reasons now. I'm not pulling this out of synonyms, but the reason the wise matters, wisdom matters, is because it's settled. It's usually practical. It's utilitarian. It's cautious. It's pragmatic. It's experienced. It's handed down through the generations. It's repeatable. It's understandable. It's tested. Wisdom's outcome-oriented. It's predictable. It involves risk management. So I don't think Paul's saying, look away. Just realize that in the course of human affairs, wisdom is deeply seated in our hearts for a lot of practical reasons. The wisdom of the wise works. It has a payoff. It's proven. And I think it's a reminder how overwhelming that practical thinking can be, because there's a great reversal taking place. And if we don't touch it and feel it and taste it, we'll be overtaken by the wisdom of the wise. And I want to just use N.T. Wright, who wrote in The Resurrection of the Son of God about this reversal. And he refers to a bunch of texts in Matthew, which is the book we're reading, about healing and resurrection. The widow's son, Jairus' daughter, for example. Resurrections, healing, radical things that are taking place. And he says, quote, "Not the least of the Beatitudes that speak of a great reversal, for the hungry to be filled, for the persecuted to inherit the kingdom. Something dramatic must be about to happen," unquote. And I think that's one of the reasons the Lectionary Committee put that together with what Paul is establishing here, that reverse, we have to confront that reversal and what it's doing in the church in order to not be overwhelmed with the utility, the practicality, and the wisdom of the wise. There's so much more. Sir, what do you think about the wisdom of the wise?
Arrogant. It's seductive. It's got an allure. It lends itself to being easily lifted and applied. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that the wisdom of the wise seems to be an unbending confidence in personal perception or experience, and sometimes just plain being right, and perhaps an unwavering sense of righteousness that's operating with a reckless sense of judgment and no compassion or love. I think that's the other piece of the puzzle that may be missing. If you're applying what would be common wisdom without compassion or love, it's not something that's going to hold people together. So I think the wisdom of the wise is also failing to recognize a simple truth because it's just too simple. The Occam's razor idea that generally the least complicated answer is the right one. And I like that, we as human beings are prone to learning from experience and building consensus and looking at what happened in other places and applying it to our condition. That's a part of our learning and our understanding. And I'm going to go with it's probably a part of the Creator that we have embedded in our DNA. Our challenge is letting go of the idea that we have all the puzzle pieces and can see the whole picture even when the puzzle is not put together.
Thanks. Charles, your thoughts on the wisdom of the wise?
I think this is a good time for me not to speak.
Okay. Well, I'm going to move on to the final question. Charles, I might start with you on this one, see if you want to get it kicked off. I got you. So there's a statement in here about our own call. Paul calls it, our call, using Paul's words. And I'm wondering, and I'm asking all of us to search our hearts, what about our own call is unique, but also what makes it collective and related to unity? Because Paul's raising this on a very personal level, but he's also raising it with the church as a whole. So what about your own call is unique, and at the same time, what makes it collective and relates it to the unity of the church that Paul's talking about? Charles, can I start with you?
Yes. I think I was going to say was, but I think it's probably a present tense. I am still deluded or guided in strange ways I'm trying to think how I had finally gotten this worded out in my own little head a while back. It was a phrase that is around in the historical discussions of belief, and I think I found for the longest time that I really was a good example of believing helped my unbelief, because I certainly appeared to be doing all the right things. That is, I went to church. I went to seminary after having spent 3 years in the Middle East as a short-term missionary, and I was still looking for understanding because I didn't have things that I could point to and say, there it is, there's why I believe. And it was a strange experience. And I spent most of my life trying to come to terms with that, and finally realized that it wasn't going to come to terms. It was just going to be the way it was, and I was going to have to work with it and live with it and to be with it, which is what's happened.
Well, thank
and
you,
I have hope. I put it this way: I have hope for the doubters and the unbelievers. In my own life, my relationship with my wife has changed dramatically since we moved here to Minnesota, and I don't put that on the poor folks here in Minnesota who have to put up with us, but just the way it is. And after over almost 60 years of marriage, we see each other completely differently now. And I just invite all y'all to be aware and open to that possibility in your own lives.
Thank you. I want to point out that, if you don't mind, Charles, after you explored those things and put that out for all the listeners, that most don't watch on Zoom, and I want to point out over your right shoulder is the Doctor of Divinity degree from Harvard. Sarah?
I think that if I were to make a statement about my own call and how it's unique, it would be a sharp and persistent understanding of my need for God's grace. keen awareness that I am not God, but that I need God for everything else to hold value and to hold together. I exist and perceive beauty only because of the grace of God. I think one of the curious things that's happened in my world is I grew up in a Presbyterian church, was baptized Methodist, grew up in a Presbyterian church, remember distinctly standing on a pew, repeating the Apostles' Creed when I was 3 or 4 at a church in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. And I remember thinking to myself, this is what we do. This is what we do. We do this together as a family. And that felt, to me, like the beginning. And it's been the same ever since. I'm still standing on a pew reciting the Apostles' Creed, trying to figure it out. So I think it is unity. I think it's coming together as a family.
Thank you. Bill, I'm going to go next. I'm saying that because there's no better guy to wrap this up than you, so heads up, coming at you. I raised these questions this week because I was struggling with all of them. And with this one, I just finally kept writing it down. So I just put a few sentences together, and forgive me, I'm just going to read them. I think it's unique to me, unique personally, because it's easy and practical to examine the call as an act of foolishness. The challenge is to confront the fact that the voice of foolishness is there. And that involves every individual heart. I think Paul is saying, we're all there. I think you hear this podcast family expressing that. We're all there. That is a common trait. And the wisdom of the wise is floating all around us. But it's also about unity because the impacts we see require the support systems of communities and the collective actions of churches. And in my experience, calling oneself foolish, which I'm good at, needs the input of others who probably deal with the same thing. And it smells a lot like doubt. But it's also about unity because we believe the whole community and the whole conversation with ourselves involves the Spirit of God. And Paul is telling the Corinthians that matter of that conversation, the presence of the Spirit of God is settled. And we can say that to each other. Bill Hull, you get to wrap this up. What are your thoughts?
Thanks for the challenge. We, as a team, sometimes josh with each other about our terminology, and Don and I have fun with my love of word mall. And Sarah, alert, here comes another one of Bill's both ands. I resonate with the both and of this question, Don. Unique and yet collective and unity. When I got your question, I underlined and highlighted those 3 words because I think it gets at the heart of wisdom, the wisdom of God. The both and. Moses stood alone in front of the burning bush, and yet his response to that call affected a whole nation of people. Jesus stood alone in the desert facing temptation, and yet his behavior there shapes our lives. And Saul, later Paul, had a unique experience on the road to Damascus, and yet we're reading his words about unity. Both and. I really resonate with my own call when I read, consider your own call, not many of you were wise, not many powerful, not many of noble birth. I've shared before on these podcasts briefly that I think I outdid Moses in resisting when I began to sense a tug toward being a minister. I thought that is absolutely beyond my capability. I still think that it is. But growing up, the examples of faith and action had an imprint on me. helping shape my understanding of myself and what God wanted me to do with my life. I think seeing my parents and others, imperfect human beings who took the gospel seriously, especially with the motto, if you see a need, meet a need, the greater good, all of that, said to me that faith matters and how we understand God matters. I think all of that helped prepare me for later the individual, unique call that I think I responded to correctly. And also, as I've studied and as science and others help us understand, all of life is connected. What happens in one part of the world affects the rest. The universe is a collective and yet unique creation. And then I will end with, we haven't studied the Beatitudes this time. That's fine. They're fairly familiar. I think they are very much grounded in the both and that you offer us. It's a unique individual choice to seek righteousness, and yet in seeking righteousness, it involves the rest of humanity. So thank you again for unique, collective, and unity.
Well, thank you, folks. And we're about to wrap up, but before we say goodbye, I'm just going to look around, see if there's any follow-up comments to wrap up. We good, everybody? Right, good? Great. Well, Palmacia Presbyterian Church podcast possible, and we thank them. They're at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. We commend that site to you for great sermons, Sunday school, the opportunity to take communion, outstanding music, prayer, meditation, differences of opinion, and studies. So check that out. And then I want to highlight the next podcast because we're going to pick up right where we left off. We're turning the page into chapter 2. We're staying in Matthew, so it's going to be Matthew, salt and light. And then we're going to go into chapter 2 of Corinthians, and Bill Hull's going to lead that discussion. So check that out. You're always welcome. We'll see you next time.